Hello, my name's Russ. We're going to talk about how bodies in fires can be used to determine fire conditions. A caution for you, this is probably the most uncomfortable presentation you're going to have on fire forensics for me. So cadavers were used as part of this analysis. I'll be reviewing some skull research that involved reconstruction of 36 skulls that were burned, and I'll also be analyzing a few studies from where actual bodies were used, cadavers. Now all these were donated to science, but just keep in mind that if you're queasy, it might be a little uncomfortable for you. So in terms of victim biology, three things to keep in mind. That the body is a source of fuel. That's fatty tissues will melt, and if there's a wick available, those fats will burn. The other thing to consider is body components will respond to fire. Our muscles, our tissue, our bones, they all have behaviors that are predictable when exposed to heat, and consequently can be used to reconstruct fire conditions. Body position can also serve as an indicator of fire severity. So just a few terms. The upper layer of your skin is known as the epidermis. It's fairly thin. It's all under 1 millimeter. Typically your skin, unlike your arm, 75 to 150 millimeters. Palms and soles, 400 to 600 millimeters. There's 1,000, micrometers. Now the dermis, that's underneath that upper layer of skin, and that's 1 to 4 millimeters, and that's where your hair follicles and blood flow it goes into your skin. Under that's fatty tissue. So when you're looking at burn severities, there's different degrees. These are up to 4th degree, and actually there are burns past 4th degree. But for what you're talking about, typically 90% of victims between 0 and 19 years of age, if they have 42% of their body burned, will recover. Now that inverts above 65 degrees, that as far as recovery rate drops to 10%. So age certainly is a factor in terms of how we respond to fires. I'm going to focus on skulls. The reason skulls are interesting is because the upper portion of your skull, it's surrounded by fairly thin material, and the bone itself is fairly thin. And therefore, those particular bones are sensitive to calcination, to just the decomposition process associated with fires. So when you look at this process of skulls in a fire, here's an image that shows heat fractures. Now the problem is these heat fractures, they can mimic blunt force trauma. And you have to carefully analyze and perform additional scrutiny in terms of organic matter around those cracks to ensure that they're not simply induced through the heat process. The watery flesh underneath your bone is going to evaporate. It's going to pressurize the skull. And then the weakening of the skull material from heat, it's going to result in stress cracks and organic material venting through those cracks. So here's a couple examples where you do have some stress cracks. If you look on the left, there are clear signs indicating that there's some organic matter, some discoloration there due to stress cracks. So let's read through this. Natural stress cracks will have organic matter venting and leaving residue. That's where crack analysis is necessary. You have to determine if those cracks occurred before or after a fire, or during a fire, I should say. Different colors and adjacent bone fragments may indicate that bone was fragmented prior to fire and burned as separate pieces. So picture blunt force trauma or ballistic trauma, such as a ballistic trauma, like a bullet. You're going to distribute bone fragments into the interior of the flesh. And because it's within the interior of the flesh, it's going to behave differently. It's going to have less heat transfer into it because it's protected by that watery mass. So that's how you can basically tell if an injury happened prior to the start of a fire or post-fire. Any radiating fracture that is in green and unburned bone may be considered due to traumatic injury prior to or during the fire and are not induced by pressure cracks. So take a look at this fracture here. This fracture emanates from the black area down into this green bone. That would suggest this was some kind of a traumatic injury, some blunt force trauma prior to the fire event. Here's two examples. One, the one on the left is actually a stress crack from fire itself. It takes some microscopy to analyze this, but what you'll notice along the edge of the crack, it's jaded, it's damaged. It suggests that there is less fire-related damage or erosion because those cracks are newer. But if you look on the right side, what will happen is with cracks, blunt force trauma prior to the fire incident, those edges, the very edges of the crack, are going to be exposed to longer durations of fire, and consequently you'll see more erosion. There's more decomposition at the very crack edge, and under a microscope you could tell that that occurred prior to fire conditions. Here's an example of a bullet and a ballistic trauma. So injuries from edged weapons. So if you have a knife going into a skull, what's going to happen is the knife wound is going to be bigger than a standard bullet in many cases. It depends on what size caliber it is, but what will happen is the skin around that wound, it's going to actually recede faster. It's a larger cut, and the very shrinking nature of skin that's dehydrating is going to cause that skin to pull away from the wound. Therefore, you're going to see more bone damage from the fire from an edge weapon wound than you will for a blunt force trauma or even a ballistic injury. Now, kind of a gruesome image, but a lot of people in past testimony have suggested that the skull is more likely to explode if you don't have any pre-fire injuries. So if for instance you don't have an exploding skull, that's been suggestive of, in the past, at least past testimony and false testimony, by the way, that there may have been some violent damage. And that's not the case. What you do have, if you look at the image in the right, what you see is that the cranial bone covering in that area, it has very thin bone and very thin amount of flesh protecting it. So it's going to be the first bone to break. And what you'll see a lot is during suppression activities, when firefighters are using hose streams to control a fire, you're going to see damage to bone structures like this. The other thing is during cleanup, during rescue, things like that, you're going to be moving those bodies and you can lose fragments, and that's the fragment you're typically going to use. So the reality is the stress cracks from overpressurization of the skull. You're going to have cracks that are going to prevent that pressure inside the skull with the same probability of venting as through a bullet hole. So making the assumption that a skull exploding can only happen if there's no blunt force trauma or ballistic impacts is false. You can't do that. You can't make that call. The other thing to consider is how tendons and muscles react to fire conditions. What happens over time is that the whole dehydration process of when a body is exposed to high heat results in changes in the orientation of our bones. And that's because as the muscles and tendons lose their water, they're going to shrink, as shown in this image. Now, these are real-life examples. These are all cadavers that were donated to science. The image on the left shows, it's time-lapsed. It shows the initial placement of the arm and the arm over time as that body is burned. So you can see there's clear movement. And this is also shown in the top two images on the right, the center top and the right top. What you can see is that there is some motion taking place here. I mean, clear motion. Almost like the body has rolled over. Arms clearly have moved. And take a look at the bottom image. Clear example of how a body can move during the fire process. So I guess the gist here is the placement of the body at the conclusion of the fire. It may be different from when the fire started, and that's not necessarily due to any nefarious activities. It may simply be due to the natural response of flesh to fire. there's only one thing during a fire that really moves. When people are trying to escape a fire, even if they have fourth degree burns on parts of their body, they can still move, and that's going to impact or otherwise bias how we might be able to interpret their body position after the fire. The other thing to keep in mind is firefighters, they're going to be involved with moving bodies, and consequently, they're going to affect body position in that process. So the conclusion here is analyze skull damage. It's very sensitive to fire conditions because of the thinness of flesh on the skull and the thinness of the bone. You can make some determinations in terms of proximity to fire and temperature and heat transfer. Also keep in mind the last two comments I made earlier, that people will move while attempting to escape fire and that bodies will move after death due to dehydration. There's several references associated with this that you can find within the annex of NFPA 91 if you wanted to do further research. Thank you for your time. Appreciate you paying attention, listening to this discussion. Have a good day.